I want to share with you a story. It's not a story of a lovely lady. Well, it is. I am a lovely lady. Um, for those of you who are not in your 50s, I was referring to the Brady Bunch. Anyway, I want to tell you a story about finding out that I am neurodivergent, that I am autistic, and that I have ADHD. If that interests you, stick around. And ta-da, I'm still here. I've tried to film this video now a few times, and it's been a little difficult because I have a tendency to be more performative when I'm speaking to people. And that's because it has something to do with masking. And I am considered a high masking, autistic, late diagnosed autistic woman. So because of my late diagnosis, and by the way, it's a self-diagnosis, I don't have a need to go through the rigmarole of going to a medical professional only to tell me that I'm not autistic. And I'll save that for another video. But if you are a neurodivergent person watching this, you may understand that some of us do self-identify and self-diagnose, and that is considered completely valid. So back to the story of the lovely lady. I am a high masking autistic woman. So what that means is that because I never had the opportunity to be diagnosed as a child, I had to learn how to show up in the world in a way that was acceptable. And over the course of 50 something years, I've learned the behaviors that are acceptable, and so I do them. Now, when I'm not masking, and I've used the word performative because here on YouTube I feel like my videos prior to this one were more performative. When I am not masking, I'm jumbled in my thoughts and I don't always make eye contact. Most of the time I do, but that's my masked self. And I'm learning now that I don't have to be masked all the time. I'm learning that my neurotype, that people who share my neurotype will understand me. So if you're watching this and you don't understand the neurotype of autism, ADHD, and other types, this might seem uncomfortable to you, and I might not be making sense, and you might not have patience, and that's okay. Sometimes I don't have patience for people who are neurotypical because I don't feel understood, nor do I always understand them. So this is going to be a very raw, unfiltered, and unscripted video. And I see I already lost my train of thought. I think a moment ago I was talking about how in the past I was more performative. Yes, so it's so hard. Let me tell you the story of finding out I was autistic. That's where I am. Hopefully you're still here with me. Last summer, maybe in the spring of 2023, I should say, I started listening to a podcast about highly sensitive people. And the podcast is called Unapologetically Sensitive. And actually, I'll leave a link for that because some people might not be familiar with it. And it's a fabulous podcast that I encourage people to listen to. And I'm not affiliated with her at all. I just enjoy it. Anyway, I had been a regular listener of this podcast, and it's led by a therapist. And she was talking about how she identified as a highly sensitive person and focused her episodes around the challenges of being highly sensitive. I had identified as a highly sensitive person for a number of years prior to that. I had read the book by Elaine Aron, and I had kind of done some deep dives into what it meant to be highly sensitive. And I was absolutely sure that that type or person, those behaviors explained me and why I reacted to the world in the way that I did. And I was so happy to have found um, that podcast. Now, I don't remember how I came across it, but I was just so happy and I listened religiously. And then one day, early in the summer of 2023, the woman who leads the podcast, and sorry, I can't remember her name right at this moment, she had said that she didn't want to disappoint her listeners or her followers, but she was starting to explore at 60 years old the idea that she might be autistic and not merely highly sensitive. And that kind of like stunned me. And she responded to that her audience might be unhappy and they might want to leave and they might be feeling left behind because she was going to start molding her podcast around her exploration of her autism. And if we as her listeners wanted to stay, we could. And if we needed to leave, that she would understand that too, but this is what she needed to do for her. So I was pissed off. I'm like, no, this was my podcast. Like, I finally found where I identified as a person in the world in my 50s, and I wanted to explore this avenue. But she left the door open to her listeners and said, you stick with me if you want. That she wasn't going to immediately make any changes. She was seeking a diagnosis and she would keep us updated. So, because I like sameness and routines, I think that's why I stuck with the podcast. Anyway, I kept listening and eventually she received her diagnosis and she was autistic. And I listened like with a grain of salt, literally. I listened with one ear and I tisked my way through a lot of her podcasts until I just started making connections. And she would talk about her experiences as a child and look back on how she presented herself to the world and what her struggles are now and whatever. She kind of spent many more of her episodes talking this through, and then I decided to start exploring that for myself. I was no longer mad. I was feeling kind of intrigued and curious. So I did some research. I took some assessments. I spoke to my personal therapist about my thoughts around this, and we kind of explored this together. I hadn't told my partner, I hadn't told my children, I hadn't told any of my friends. I just kind of kept it to myself. But I was feeling really, at first, really proud. Like, oh, I found something that explains me. And then I went through a period of time, and I still go through this because it's still only been a year. I go through some times where I get really sad. Like, would my life have been different had I known this when I was a kid? Would I have had a different experience making friends? Would I have had a different experience in school? Would I have had a different experience with my now broken relationship with my older sister? A lot of things come into play. Anyway, that was a year ago where I came to the understanding that I am autistic. And then it was many months later that ADHD even popped into the scene. my oldest son, who's 22, was he was diagnosed with ADHD at 18. He did that on his own and advocated for himself after he finished high school. But prior, when he was in like second grade, we had him diagnosed initially way back then. And the doctor at that time wasn't too concerned. He described it as my son having, like, if there's 10 soldiers that do all the work in your brain, my son had one soldier that was missing and wasn't doing his job. So he was working on 9 soldiers. I thought that was a cute way to explain this to my child. And we decided not to medicate him at the time. It didn't seem to be affecting him as a young child. Anyway, he diagnosed himself, and then after his diagnosis. Okay, so sadly, the second half of my story I had to delete because my microphone stopped working, and like the whole rest of my autistic journey, I had to delete. So I'm just going to try to wrap that one up. After my son was diagnosed as a teenager, and then we started considering that too with my daughter, who is a few years younger than him. And then in my research, I was realizing that the neurodivergent brain is a trait that's passed through families. It can be genetic, and I kind of started putting all the dots together, and it was like, yeah, their dad doesn't have the ADHD component. My dad likely has ADHD, which meant that I likely had ADHD too. And I just started making connections with all of our behavior and all of the ways that we interacted with the world and all of the challenges that we collectively had together. So that too is a self-diagnosis, which is completely valid. Before anybody says to me, you can't say that because you haven't been to a doctor, I'm not going to a doctor. And I'll explain it to you briefly, but because I'm already at this age, I've raised my children, I have had a successful career, and my needs are generally low. And because I am high masking, it would be very, historically, it's very common for diagnosticians to miss ADHD and autism in women my age. They tend to diagnose as anxiety disorders or bipolar disorder or anything else, and then medicate for those situations. In addition to that, finding a diagnostician who specializes in neurodivergence can take a long time. It can cost thousands of dollars, and it can take a couple of years for a diagnosis to come through. So at this point in my life, I don't need a doctor to tell me what I am or who I am. Like, I know. I have enough life experience to advocate for myself and to be able to name this for myself. Anyway, I think I'm going to cut it short there. There's a lot to say, and I'll be sharing more about these traits of mine in future videos. But if you're still here, which I hope you are, if you're curious or have any questions about my neurodivergent traits or about how I came to understand that or how it has affected me in my life, I'm happy to answer them. So please leave your respectful questions in the comments. If you are yourself are autistic, ADHD, if you identify as neurodivergent, I would also love to hear from you. So please introduce yourself and let's chat. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.